You were in a room full of people. Maybe it was a party. Maybe it was an office happy hour. Maybe it was one of those social events that everyone who's around you seemed to navigate effortlessly, moving from conversation to conversation, laughing at the right moments, exchanging numbers before the night was over. And you were there physically present, saying the right things at the right intervals. And somehow, despite being surrounded by people, you felt completely, quietly alone. Not because you're antisocial, not because you don't want connection, but because something about the way you're wired makes the casual version of it feel like performing in a language you never quite learned. And here's what genuinely fascinates me about this. Because the people who struggle most to make friends are rarely the ones who need connection least. They're often the ones who need it most deeply, and whose brains make the path to it the most complicated. The psychology behind this is more specific and more fascinating than most people ever get to hear explained. Here's what makes this psychology so worth understanding and so rarely understood. Most people who struggle to make friends have been handed one of two explanations their whole lives. Either something is wrong with them, they're too shy, too awkward, too sensitive, too much, or they just haven't tried hard enough. They need to put themselves out there more, be more open, stop overthinking every interaction before it's even finished. And if you've spent years receiving that feedback from well-meaning people who genuinely don't understand why what comes naturally to them feels impossible to you, I want to say this directly. Neither of those explanations is accurate, and both of them have cost you something. Because what the research actually shows is that people who find friendship difficult aren't socially deficient. They're operating with a specific set of psychological traits, traits that are real, measurable, and in many cases genuinely rare, that make the standard model of friendship feel like wearing a coat that doesn't fit. Think about the person who leaves every social event exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't quite fix, or the one who has had the same two close friends for 15 years and genuinely cannot figure out how to add a third, or the one who can talk for hours with someone they trust completely and feels like a stranger in a room full of acquaintances they've known for years. These aren't failures of effort, these are the fingerprints of a specific psychological profile. And once you see the profile clearly, the overthinking, the depth-seeking, the sensitivity to inauthenticity, it stops looking like a flaw and starts looking like something that makes a great deal of sense. So, what's actually happening inside the brain of someone who finds friendship genuinely difficult? Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Your brain's social processing system runs a continuous risk assessment every time you enter a social situation. For most people, that assessment is relatively quiet, background noise. But for people with high sensitivity, strong depth seeking, and elevated social self-awareness, that system runs at full volume. Researchers at Stony Brook University studying the trait of high sensitivity, what psychologist Elaine Aron identified as sensory processing sensitivity, found that roughly 15 to 20% of the population processes social and emotional information significantly more deeply than average. What that means for you is this: you're not overthinking social situations just because you're anxious. You're processing them more thoroughly than most people's brains are even capable of. Be honest. Have you ever replayed a conversation hours after it ended, noticing things the other person probably didn't even register? That's not a malfunction. That's a nervous system doing its job with unusual thoroughness. And then loss aversion enters the picture. A brain that processes social information deeply also processes the risk of rejection more acutely. Research from UCLA's Social Neuroscience Lab found that social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain, literally the same regions of the brain. What that means is the caution that makes some people slow to trust, slow to reach out, slow to try again after being hurt, isn't weakness. It's a nervous system that has learned accurately that connection carries real cost, and it's protecting you the only way it knows how. So how do you actually work with this brain, instead of spending your life apologizing for it? Not by forcing yourself to become someone who finds small talk easy. Not by performing sociability until you collapse with exhaustion afterward. But by understanding the three core clusters that drive this profile and what each one actually needs. The depth-seeking brain doesn't struggle with connection. It struggles with shallow connection and has often been told that's the same thing. Psychologists call this relational selectivity, a documented pattern in high-sensitivity individuals where the brain reserves full social engagement for interactions it assesses as genuinely meaningful. It's not aloofness, it's discernment. What this needs in new social situations: stop trying to make friends. Start trying to find one person in the room worth a real conversation. 1. Lower the requirement from make a connection to find one thing genuinely interesting about one person. Your brain can do that. It does it naturally when the stakes feel lower. What this needs in existing relationships: go deeper, not wider. Instead of trying to add more people, invest in the ones already there. Ask one question you actually want the answer to. Share one thing true instead of comfortable. Depth compounds, and your brain is built for it. The social processing brain isn't anxious, it's thorough. And thorough processing in a world optimized for fast, surface-level interaction creates a specific kind of friction that most people never have to name. Psychologists call this pattern evaluative hypervigilance, heightened attention to social signals, combined with a strong internal evaluator that reviews every interaction for evidence of acceptance or rejection. At work, when you catch yourself replaying a conversation, stop analyzing the content and ask one question instead. Did I behave in line with who I actually am? If yes, the conversation is closed. Your brain doesn't need more data. It needs permission to stop collecting it. In social situations, give yourself a specific exit condition before you arrive. I will stay for 45 minutes, have one real conversation, and leave without guilt. Pre-deciding reduces the cognitive load that makes social events feel like endurance tests. You're not escaping. You're managing your nervous system intelligently. The cautious connector isn't closed off. They're self-protecting, and for good reason. This nervous system that has experienced social pain doesn't forget it. It builds a perimeter, and that perimeter, which once kept something out, can eventually keep everything out. Psychologists call the path through this graduate exposure with secure base, a framework from attachment research showing that cautious connectors build trust most effectively through repeated, low-stakes, consistent contact rather than through intense or fast-moving intimacy. In practice, find one low-pressure recurring context: a class, a regular coffee spot, a hobby group, where you see the same people repeatedly without the expectation of friendship. Let familiarity do what forced connection can't. Your nervous system needs evidence of safety before it will let down its perimeter. Give it time to collect that evidence without demanding a result. For energy management, stop treating social exhaustion as a personal failure. Schedule recovery time after social events the way you'd schedule recovery after physical exertion. You're not antisocial. You're high cost to run, and high cost systems need more maintenance. That's not a flaw. That's a specification. Here is what I want you to hear, maybe for the first time in a way that actually lands. You were never bad at friendship. You were attempting a standard model of connection that was never designed for how your brain works. And you've been measuring yourself against it for long enough. You weren't too sensitive. You weren't too quiet. You weren't too much, or too little, or too anything. You were processing the world more deeply than most people around you, and doing it without a manual, without anyone explaining what was actually happening, and often without anyone who understood. The friendships you do have, the real ones, the ones that survive the depth test, are not accidents. They are evidence of exactly how much you're capable of when the conditions are right. Now you know what the conditions actually are.